It was just another Friday night, or so I thought. After a long week at work, I was looking forward to a quiet evening by myself. My apartment wasn't anything special, but it had become a comforting space over the past few months. I had set myself up for a relaxing night. A simple pasta dinner, maybe a glass of wine, and then binge-watching whatever was left on my Netflix list. The kitchen was warm and smelled like garlic, olive oil, and basil. The stove hummed quietly, and the water was boiling, the sound calming in its own way. I felt content, peaceful even. There was no sense of foreboding or anything unusual that night. Just me, my kitchen, and the thoughts of a quiet weekend ahead. But that was before things changed. I had just finished chopping some vegetables when I noticed it. The air around me was suddenly freezing, the kind of cold that sinks straight into your bones. It happened so fast. 1 second, everything was fine. The next, the temperature had dropped by at least 20 degrees. My first thought was practical. Maybe I had left a window open or maybe the heating had gone off, but there was no rational explanation. I paused, wiping my hands on a dish towel, and glanced around. No windows were open. The heater was still on. Yet the cold was undeniable. A sharp, biting chill that had no business being in a closed, warm apartment. Then I noticed something else, the kitchen light. It flickered once, then again, and with each flicker it dimmed just a little more. The warmth of the room, the comforting glow of the light bulb, all of it seemed to be sucked away. I didn't want to admit it at first, but something was wrong. Deep down, I felt it. My chest tightened, a knot forming in my stomach. I tried to convince myself that it was just faulty wiring or some strange electrical surge. But even that couldn't explain the cold. The feeling of being watched came next, and it was unmistakable. I stopped what I was doing, the knife still in my hand, and listened. My heart started racing, though I couldn't hear anything unusual. No footsteps, no creaking floorboards, just the faint hum of the refrigerator and the pot of water boiling on the stove. But I could feel it. Someone was in the room with me. I turned slowly, my eyes scanning the kitchen, the hallway, every corner of the apartment that I could see from where I stood. Nothing, but the air felt heavy, thick with something I couldn't explain. And then, just out of the corner of my eye, I saw it, a shadow. I almost didn't believe it at first. It was just a fleeting glimpse, like a trick of the light. But then I saw it again, this time more clearly. At the far end of the hallway, near the entrance to my bedroom, something was standing there. No, not something, someone. It took a moment for my brain to catch up with what I was seeing. The figure was tall, much taller than anyone I had ever seen. It stood completely still, but its presence was undeniable, its silhouette darker than the surrounding shadows. My mouth went dry, and a chill shot down my spine that had nothing to do with the cold in the room. I couldn't make out its face at first. In fact, there was no face, just this featureless mass of shadow where a head should have been. But then, as if the darkness itself shifted, I saw them. 2 glowing red eyes, burning like embers in the void. They weren't just looking at me, they were piercing into me, locking me in place. Every instinct I had screamed to run, to get out of there, but my feet wouldn't move. It felt like the very air around me had turned into something solid, like I was trapped in a thick, suffocating fog. My breath caught in my throat, my hands shaking as the knife fell from my grip and clattered onto the floor. The figure took a step forward. Its body was still mostly in shadow, but its outline became clearer with each passing second. I could see the faint gleam of something metallic, armor, perhaps, clinging to its broad frame. It was ancient, terrifying, like it had stepped out of some long-forgotten nightmare. The horns on its head curved upward, jagged and unnatural, like a crown of pure malice. And the cold grew worse. The moment it moved closer, I could feel my heart thudding against my chest, every beat echoing louder than the last. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. My throat felt tight, like I was being strangled by the very air around me. The presence was overwhelming, pressing down on me, suffocating me with its malevolent energy. It didn't have to say a word. Its sheer presence was enough to communicate 1,000 unspoken horrors. The fear it brought was primal, the kind that made every muscle in my body seize up. I felt like a child again, helpless in the face of some unseen terror. But this time, the monster wasn't hiding under the bed. It was standing right in front of me. My legs gave out and I fell to the floor. This wasn't something I could fight. This was something far older, far darker than anything I had ever imagined. For what felt like an eternity, the Oni stood there watching me. Its eyes seemed to flicker, burning with some ancient fire that made my stomach churn. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what was happening. I had heard stories about Oni, demons from Japanese folklore. They were said to be harbingers of disaster, bringers of death and destruction. But this wasn't just a story. This was real, and it was standing in my apartment. The room seemed to shift around me, the walls warping and bending as if they were being pulled into some dark abyss. The hallway stretched out longer than it should have, and the shadows around the Oni deepened, swallowing up everything in their path. I was on the verge of losing consciousness, my vision blurring as the world around me twisted into something unrecognizable. The air was thick with dread, a suffocating terror that left no room for rational thought. It felt like the Oni was pulling me into its world, dragging me down into a place where light and warmth could never reach. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, it was gone. One blink, and the Oni vanished, leaving nothing but the faintest whisper of cold air in its wake. The oppressive weight lifted, and I found myself gasping for breath, my body trembling uncontrollably. The warmth of the room returned slowly, but it felt hollow, like the heat was struggling to push out the lingering darkness that still clung to the walls. I sat there for a long time trying to process what had just happened. My mind was reeling, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. But the apartment was quiet again, as if nothing had ever been there. No trace of the Oni, no shadow, no sound. Just the distant hum of the refrigerator and the faint hiss of the stove that I had forgotten to turn off. I didn't touch the dinner I had been cooking. I didn't even bother cleaning up the mess. Instead, I went straight to my room, locked the door, and sat in the corner, staring at the hallway. That night, I didn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those red, glowing orbs staring back at me. I could still feel its presence, like it was just waiting for the right moment to return. The fear hadn't left. It had burrowed deep into me, wrapping itself around my thoughts, my mind, my very soul. I didn't know if it was truly gone. Maybe it was watching from the shadows, waiting for me to lower my guard. Maybe it was still out there, lurking in the corners of my apartment, ready to drag me into whatever hell it had come from. One thing was certain, I would never feel safe in that apartment again. I must have fallen asleep eventually, though it was the kind of restless sleep that doesn't feel like rest at all. When I woke up, the first thing I noticed was the sunlight pouring through the window, spilling across the floor in soft, golden waves. For a brief moment, I felt relief. Morning light has a way of making nightmares seem distant, like something that only exists in the dark. But as I sat up, the chill in the air reminded me that what happened last night wasn't a nightmare. I looked around my bedroom, still half expecting to see the Oni lurking in the shadows, but the room was quiet, still. It felt surreal, like the events of the night before were just a figment of my imagination. I tried to shake off the fear clinging to me, forcing myself to breathe slowly, telling myself it was over. but deep down I knew it wasn't. I walked into the kitchen cautiously, as if expecting the Oni to be standing there, waiting. The light was bright and warm, the morning sun making the room look deceptively peaceful. But the mess from last night was still there. The pasta I had never cooked, the knife I had dropped, the pan still sitting on the stove, cold and untouched. The kitchen looked frozen in time, as if the events of the night had never left. I didn't have the energy to clean. Instead, I needed to talk to someone, anyone, just to reassure myself that I wasn't losing my mind. But who could I call? How could I explain what I had seen? "Hey, I think I was haunted by a demon last night," wasn't exactly a conversation starter. I scrolled through my contacts anyway, my thumb hesitating over a few names, but I couldn't bring myself to call. What if no one believed me? Worse, what if someone did believe me and told me this was just the beginning? That thought alone was enough to keep me quiet. So instead, I did the only thing that made sense. I searched the internet. I typed in Oni into the search bar, half expecting to find nothing but stories from mythology or weird internet conspiracy sites. At first, that's exactly what I found. Legends about Oni, tales of vengeful spirits, ancient Japanese folklore. Most of the stories described them as demons who punished the wicked or haunted places of suffering. They were usually depicted as large, grotesque creatures, with sharp teeth, horns, and fiery red or blue skin. But what I had seen, it wasn't like that. More shadow than substance, more silent than savage. Yet its presence had filled me with a dread that went beyond any myth. As I scrolled deeper, my heart raced when I stumbled upon a forum. It wasn't anything official, just a thread on some obscure paranormal site, hidden between stories of haunted houses and ghostly apparitions. The post was old, a few years at least, but what caught my attention was the title, Oni in the Shadows? I clicked, my breath catching in my throat as I read. It started with the cold. The whole room dropped in temperature out of nowhere. Then I saw it, a shadow standing at the end of the hallway. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light, but when it moved, I knew it wasn't. It didn't have a face, just two glowing red eyes, staring straight at me. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. I felt like I was being pulled into the darkness. And then it vanished. My blood ran cold. It was exactly what had happened to me. I scrolled through the replies, most of them dismissing the post as a hoax or an overactive imagination. But a few others described similar experiences. They all mentioned the same things. The sudden drop in temperature, the shadowy figure, the glowing red eyes. One reply stood out more than the others. It was from a user named Yuri Watcher, and their comment chilled me to the bone. If you see an Oni once, it's a warning. But if it comes back, it's already too late. Oni don't just haunt, they claim. Be careful. Don't ignore the signs. I stared at the screen, my heart pounding in my chest. The idea that this wasn't a one-time occurrence, that the Oni could return, filled me with a kind of dread I hadn't felt since last night. The air in the room suddenly felt colder, as if reading about it was somehow drawing it back into my life. I closed the laptop, pushing it away from me like it was the source of my fear. But the feeling wouldn't go away. The sense that something had changed, something fundamental, lingered in the apartment like a bad smell. I could almost hear that low hum from the night before, like something vibrating just beneath the surface of reality, waiting to break through. For the rest of the day, I tried to go about my normal routine, pretending that everything was fine. I cleaned up the kitchen, put away the food I had left out, and forced myself to eat something, even though my stomach was in knots. I kept telling myself that what happened last night couldn't happen again, that it was over. But as the sun started to set, the familiar dread began to creep back in. I noticed small things first, an odd flicker of the lights, the way shadows seemed just a little too deep in the corners of the room. The apartment was too quiet, the kind of quiet that made you feel like you weren't alone, even though you knew you were. By the time night fell, the cold returned. It wasn't as sudden this time, but it was just as unnatural. The air became icy, despite the heater running full blast. My breath came out in visible puffs, and I felt that now familiar pressure in the atmosphere, as if something heavy was pushing down on me from all sides. I didn't need to turn around to know it was there. I could feel it, standing in the doorway of the kitchen, watching me. My heart pounded, my body tensing with a primal terror that made it hard to think, hard to breathe. Slowly, I turned. The Oni was there just like before. Its shadowy form seemed to absorb the light around it, leaving the hallway in utter darkness. Its red eyes glowed, brighter this time, their gaze locking onto mine with an intensity that made me feel like I was drowning in fear. It took a step closer, and the cold intensified, so much that I could see frost forming on the windows and the floor beneath its feet. My legs shook, but I forced myself to stand my ground. Running wasn't an option, not anymore. I needed to know why it was here, what it wanted. The Oni stepped closer, its massive form towering over me, even though it wasn't fully physical. The weight of its presence was crushing, like gravity itself was pulling me into the floor. I tried to speak, but my throat was dry, my voice caught in my chest. But before I could even try, something strange happened. The Oni stopped. It was as if it was studying me, waiting. Then, for the first time, it moved its hand. Slowly, it extended one dark, clawed finger and pointed at something behind me. I turned, confused, my mind racing. There was nothing there, just the kitchen counter. But then I saw it. A piece of paper, lying neatly on the counter, though I was certain it hadn't been there before. I picked it up, my hands trembling. The paper was old, yellowed around the edges, with strange symbols drawn across it. Japanese characters, ancient and intricate, ones I couldn't begin to understand. But there was one thing written in English at the bottom, in bold, sharp letters. You were chosen. The words sent a fresh wave of terror through me. Chosen? Chosen for what? My hands shook as I clutched the paper, my mind reeling. The Oni remained where it stood, watching me, its glowing eyes never leaving my face. I felt like I was on the edge of something far worse than what had already happened. I realized with a sinking feeling that the Oni hadn't just appeared randomly. It had a purpose. I don't remember sitting down. It was still standing there, towering over me like some ancient executioner, waiting for the right moment to strike. My mind raced, the weight of the situation crushing me from every angle. I was trapped. There was no escape. Every breath felt like it could be my last. But then, through the fog of panic, a single thought pierced through. I had to tell someone. Someone had to know what was happening to me. With shaking hands, I grabbed my phone off the counter. My fingers fumbled as I opened the messaging app and tapped on the contact of my closest friend, Mark. I didn't have time to type anything out. I wasn't even sure my mind could form coherent words at that point, so I hit the record button for a voice message. I started speaking, though my voice was barely more than a whisper. My throat was tight with fear, and I could feel the cold breath of the Oni filling the room as it stood just feet away, watching. I didn't have long. Mark, I stopped, my voice cracking. I forced myself to keep going, my heart pounding so hard it felt like it might burst from my chest. I don't know what's happening, but I don't think I have much time. The room seemed to darken further as I spoke, the Oni's presence pressing down on me like a storm. Last night, I saw something. I thought it was just, I don't know, my mind playing tricks on me. But it's real, Mark. It's in my apartment right now. I glanced up at the Oni. Its eyes blazed with a terrifying intensity, but it didn't move. It was as if it was waiting for me to finish, as though it knew these were my last moments. It's some kind of demon, I continued, my voice shaking. An Oni, from those old Japanese stories. I can't explain it. I think I was chosen. There's a note here. It says you were chosen, but I don't know for what. Mark, I'm scared. I don't know what's going to happen to me. I choked back a sob, trying to hold it together long enough to finish the message. If you don't hear from me after this, find someone. Tell them what I said. Don't come here, whatever this thing is. I don't think it can be stopped. My grip on the phone tightened, the fear overwhelming me as I felt the Oni's presence draw even closer. I knew my time was running out. I don't know what I did to deserve this. I ended the message, my hand trembling as I lowered the phone. I tried to send it, my finger hovering over the button, but just as I pressed send, the cold swept over me like a wave, and everything around me shifted. When Mark arrived at the apartment, the door was slightly ajar. He hesitated, dread filling his stomach. He called out his friend's name, but there was only silence. He stepped inside cautiously, his footsteps echoing unnervingly in the empty space. The apartment was eerily cold. Frost clung to the windows, despite it being the middle of spring. The kitchen was in disarray, as though someone had left in a hurry, but there was no sign of his friend. No trace of a struggle, just absence. Mark searched the whole place, but there was nothing, no sign of where his friend had gone. It was like he had simply vanished into thin air. The only thing that remained was the strange feeling in the air, a chill that seemed to linger, almost as if something was still watching.